Hi, I am Janet Davenport, and I am a book with Simsbury's Human Library. The title of my book is Pioneering Journalist. And the reason that that's the title of my book is because, indeed, I was a pioneering journalist in the 70s, the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, post-civil rights America, 20th century. I did not start out my journalism career to be a pioneer. I just wanted to be a journalist. But because of the times and because of the composition, the racial and ethnic composition of the newsroom, I found myself as a pioneer during that period, which meant that very often, I was the only, I teasingly call it the lonely only. I was the only Black woman. I often was the only African American at a time when not only people of color, but women were beginning to be hired in the newsroom to cover the news. Well, I often hesitate when people ask me about my formative years or how I grew up because for a very long time when people said, well, where are you from? Even as a teenager, I did not know how to answer that. I am the daughter of an Army officer, a military career, 22 years. My dad was in the Army, which meant that we traveled a lot. And just to give you a little flavor, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. I began my early childhood at Fort Benning, Georgia. And from there, we went to Missouri, the Ozark Mountains at Fort Leonard Wood. And then we moved to Munich, Germany, which is where I began my early childhood education. I went to kindergarten and first grade in Munich. My baby brother was born in Munich. And then we returned to the United States. My parents, who were both Southerners, said, we're going home. And I remember as a child saying, well, I thought we were home. They said, no, this isn't our home. We are Americans. We're going back home. And when we came back to America, we started in New York City because we hadn't seen family for many, many years. And some of them had not even seen the babies who had been born while we were traveling. And from there, we went to visit family in Augusta, Georgia. And I remember it vividly because it was just such a range of different people. It was a lot of Black people. It's like, this is your family. And we went to Georgia, and I was out of school for so long that my parents put me in a first grade school, and it was a segregated school. And I remember saying to my Mom, there's only one white girl in the whole school. And my mother said, well, that's quite impossible because there are no white children who go to this school. So I was very confused. Then from there, we moved so now it's 1960, early 1960, 1961. We moved and settled, I thought, in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And I think there may have been only one other African-American family in town. And I'm told I was the first African-American child to go to the elementary school there. They even contacted my mother, my parents, because they wanted to make sure that my transition was as smooth as possible, because I later learned historically this was right around the time that Ruby Bridges and the children who were desegregating the schools down south were having a very different kind of experience. And the moving didn't stop. From there, we moved on base, or Army post, at Fort Devens, where my dad retired. From there, it was New Jersey. We thought we were going to settle there. And then finally, at last, when I was about 11, 12 years old, we settled in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is where I went to middle school and high school. And I consider Springfield my home because that is where I came of age. And so my story, I wish I could tell it more succinctly, but it's just not. It wasn't a straight line. There's so many people I've met in life. I was always so envious of them that they were born and raised in the same town. They were born and raised in the town of their aunties, their uncles, and their grandparents. And that was not my destiny, and that's not my story. So I come from a very diverse, my formative years were very diverse because during those travels I had many different kinds of friends because the military desegregated before the rest of the country. I believe it was President Eisenhower desegregated the military. So when we lived on army posts and in military communities, it was nothing to have friends who had Asian backgrounds. We had Jewish neighbors. I had neighbors. I grew up with Irish people, Italian people, Filipino people, Latino. And so multiculturalism was very much a part of my experience and my perspective. So by the time I was 12 years old, I felt I had traveled more than the average adult, and I had been introduced to more cultures than the average adult. And certainly my peers, so that kind of made me a little more of an other. I did. I had the opportunity, but back in those days, silly me, I was the first in my family to go to college. I was the first, not in my extended family. I had cousins. In fact, it's interesting. My southern cousins had one of my father's sisters was a teacher. So I come from a family of teachers and preachers and educators, and they had gone on to teachers' colleges and that sort of thing. But we were the Northerners, and I was the first to go to college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it sounds kind of silly saying this. I should have majored in English and literature, but I didn't because I wanted to stretch myself. So, of all things, I applied to Boston University, and I got into their School of Nursing. So I started out as kind of more of a science major. And when I got to college, it got to university and discovered, wow, there's so many things I can study. And my dad said to me, I'm really surprised, Janet, that you didn't become an English major. So I went through a period as an undergrad where, I had some personal issues and then some relationship issues. And long story short, things got a little complicated. And so I dropped out of school. Like I said, this is a very expensive place to not know what you want to be when you grow up. But the truth of the matter is I did not know what I wanted to be. I did know what I wanted to be. You know what? I did know what I wanted to be. But it seemed so far-fetched at the time. I wanted to be a writer. But what did that mean? I just wanted to write. I wanted to tell people stories. And I should say here, as a child, I dreamt of being a writer because I loved stories. I loved to read. And an important thing I kind of left out, and I'm jumping around, and I loved people's stories, to know where people came from, what shaped them. I was an observer, as a 17, 18-year-old, I hadn't quite put it together in a career. And during this time that I went away to college, there were no role models. There were role models in terms of character, drive, taking care of your family, going to college, but there were no I didn't even think about journalism. I didn't even think about journalism as a viable path. I don't remember seeing newscasters. I don't remember seeing anything written in the paper about by Black people. It didn't seem possible. But when I got to Boston, my horizons broadened, and I began to discover more possibilities. And I wanted to be a writer. But even then, it wasn't a straight line. It was more of a spiral. I did drop out of school and then disillusioned. And at the time, I moved back home to Springfield. I felt I was trying to make a decision about whether or not to move out to the Midwest with my partner at the time. You know, I'm going to tell you the truth. There's always a man behind every woman's story, every smart woman's story. There's always a man. There's always a romance, and I had married young, and so I separated from my husband to try to figure out what it was I wanted to do. And I shared this. One of the stories I shared as a book with one of my readers. I'd like to share it now. It's okay. The way I got my first journalism job, because I knew I wanted to write for, and I think my job objective, a reputable publication. Well, that would be hard to define right now, but back in the late 70s, so we're talking maybe 78, 79, I'm staying at my parents'. I said, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I need a job. I started, my parents I'm trying to think how many miles they lived from downtown. I actually started walking. I didn't have a car. And I saw a friend and I I bummed a ride downtown. And I said to my friend, drop me off right there. It was the newspaper. It was a big building on Main Street. I said, I'm going to go in there and ask for a job. I'm going to go there and see if they have any job openings. Because those were the days you filled out job applications and you actually went inside buildings and interfaced with people. And I went in there, and I remember what I wore, because I'm a writer, you know, these details. I had on my skinny jeans, I had on a sweatshirt, and my hair was cropped, very short, little short afro. And I went in and I said to the receptionist, I'd like to speak to the editor. And she said, oh, okay, hold on. And she said, hello, Mr. Garvey. And his name was Richard Garvey. And I'm going to say his name because the late Richard Garvey, Google him. He was a legend in Massachusetts at the time, encyclopedic mind. He was the editor of the paper. And he said, send her right up. And I walked up the steps and I walked into the newsroom, and that they were typing on their typewriters. I saw a few women, but most all men. It was just this, it was the bullpen. And this you know, like you've seen on TV or read about in books. And it was all white guys. A lot of old white guys, some younger white guys. So I'm aware of that. So I went and sat outside Mr. Garvey's office and had a nice chat with Mr. Garvey. And I was so enthusiastic. I look back on it, I think it was my enthusiasm. And then the question he asked me was, so did you go to school in Springfield, a high school? And I said, yes. And I told him my English teacher, I had taken this advanced composition course. He said, oh, if you had her, I know you can string words together. So I got a job as a stringer, making 25 cents a word. And I remember, and I worked with, he assigned me to work with the city editor at the time. Now, mind you, as I tell you, I was a college dropout. My city editor, he was not a college graduate. A lot of the people in the newsroom were not college graduates. You want to talk about merit? Those were those stories you hear about working your way up. There was still that in a bit in the atmosphere. So I was really taken on as an apprentice. A lot of journalists back in the old days, because journalism is considered a trade. That's a trade. It's a part of the intellectual industry, but it's a craft, it's a trade. And a lot of newspaper men became newspaper men, working their way up as gophers. But then, they start having educational requirements. And I did that for maybe 6 months, 7, 8, 9 months, and then I left and I went back to college. I went back to school, but not for journalism. I did take some journalism courses, but I went back to school and I got a degree in social work. Yes, because I was an editorial page editor in Springfield, and then I was on the editorial board at the Hartford Courant. So those were two, in both of those positions, they had challenges, similar challenges, and different challenges because at the Springfield newspaper, I was, and another woman then was hired, a white woman, and we became friends, was also hired as an editorial page editor. So part of the challenges were you could tell there were assumptions about the girls. It was assumed, for example, she and I would be discussing an issue that we were going to editorialize, and we were kind of doing an analysis of a social issue or an event in the news. And the guys would treat us like we were chatting about daycare, which would have been fine, but we're chatting on the job. Men discuss important issues, women chat. We were treated like chatty Cathys. We had administrative support for the editorial page editors. If the guys, because the editorial board at Springfield was small, it was the executive editor, the publisher, these two senior white guys, and then myself and my other female colleague. If we asked for administrative support, we wouldn't get it. We would get a hard time, even from the female clerks. If I expected something to be done in the production room, because we were in charge, this is kind of inside baseball, but in order to put those pages out back in those days, we were putting those, you're writing the editorial, you're researching, you're writing the editorial, you're talking to people, and we were responsible for the production of those pages, which was another thing I had going, as I was not afraid of technology, and I could do pagination and layout. And I heard that one specific incident was they didn't know at the time when my daughter had a little internship in the production room back there, and they didn't know she was my daughter. And she said to me, "Mom, every time you come back to the production room to check on something, they say, here comes that BITCH again." And the first time I heard that they were calling me a BI, because I had expectations. Is this ready? Is this done? Can you fix this? I lamented that to my white female colleague who was old. She was older than I was, and she had more editing experience. She said sarcastically, "You have arrived." In other words, you're doing your job. That's what. In other words, you've heard those stories. When a woman is doing her job, she's a BITCH. When a man's doing his job, he's the man. In terms of color, one of the biggest challenges was the ignorance within the newsroom itself among my, when I say ignorance, not that they were intellectually ignorant, but so woefully, culturally, and historically deficient. So that a lot of my time was spent educating. And I know that sounds kind of pompous as I'm saying it now, but I'm just glad to be able to have the opportunity to tell the truth. Because I feel like that's the truth that doesn't get told. I'll never forget one day I was standing in the newsroom and I said, you know what? The hard part about this job is making people here, my colleagues, aware that they're not correct about certain things. So, for example, in the community, if a white child or white girl would go missing, there's headlines. If a black child or black girl would go missing, where's the story? And so if you brought that up, oh, you have a chip on your shoulder. Why is everything about race? Because if you're at the table discussing things and making decisions, and you bring up a perspective or bring up about black people, always about race, 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 And I said, people are so prickly. They were so prickly. Now remember, I grew up in a home that was comfortable talking about race. I had many different kinds of friends. And sometimes I would just want to bring up a cultural notion or idea. You would think I'd thrown a Molotov cocktail in the room or something.
That's where the pioneering came in.
That's where the pioneering, I was fighting so much for, and there were editorial standards, and sometimes there were double standards. So for example, in the Massachusetts, in the Western Mass paper, there had been a decision that neighborhoods would be identified in the paper specifically by a neighborhood. So for example, if you have I'm going to use Connecticut as an example. So I'm sure there's neighborhood, Terrifville, right? Is that a neighborhood, right? The way that it was used in identifying a community, in the white community in the paper, they would say, in the Terrifville neighborhood last night. But when they did it in the black community, it would be in the Mason Square. They would lump they were all distinct neighborhoods, but they would lump them all together because everybody knew that was the black section of the town. It's just like in a city, you have the Italian section, you have the black section, you have the Irish section. And so they would be, and I brought that to an editor's attention. And the other thing too, back in those days, I was, everybody in the newsroom had a potty mouth. That was the other thing too, that was intimidating for the girls. And for me, as a black woman, I wasn't accustomed to being the F-bomb. And he used the F-bomb. I was bringing it to an editor's attention that I thought the policy was that you're going to specify, tease out the neighborhood. And he said something to the effect of, oh, it's all the same. It's a stone throw away. It's all the same. And he used the F-bomb. And I used the F-bomb back. And then my friends and I, because we had a little crew, white and black, was and we went to lunch, and I said, and the whole time at lunch, I said, I think I just lost my job. But I felt very passionately about that, and I came back, and he had sent out an edict to all of the editors to stop lumping. It was worded much more officially to stop doing that, and that this neighborhood is this neighborhood, this neighborhood is, and stop. In other words, so what people never saw back in those days, and even into the early 21st century, the mistakes and the damage and the trauma that didn't make it into the paper because somebody was fighting, and it was a war of words. It was an intellectual war to make certain things not happen. No, don't use that. Don't refer to people like that. Don't use that language. That minorities, for example, that was a big one. That's a government term, I never wrote a story using that language. There's so many different ways to call. I remember someone saying, well, what do we call? I said, we'll call them are they? What do they want to be called? These are the kind of editorial board discussions, you know. Why are they flying that flag all the time? Well, why don't you ask them? Do you know? And that's the point. The underlying point is that I was working with people who were not in relationship or conversation with people who did not look like them. But yet and still, they were covering the stories and the lives of these people who did not look like them. I'm gonna give you one more example. A court reporter came in one time. There was a murder. There's this trial, and maybe it wasn't a murder trial. There was a trial going on, and I remember the court reporter coming in and being disgusted because the young black man that was being tried, I think he might have been 17 or 18, he wasn't even interested in his own case. He was on the bench outside the courtroom sagging and sleeping. I said, well, what do you, all right. If you've spent the night locked up in jail what would you be doing the next day? Looking fresh as a rose? You know, those kinds of things. It was like, we've got to take it and remember to look at people and that's what always gets me too. I don't see color. That was the other thing. By the time I got to Hartford, those were the days of I don't see color. That was the colorblind. That was I call that chapter, it's colorblind. A well-meaning colleague said to me, in fact, he was my boss, and I have a lot of respect for him to this day. Wonderful, wonderful editorial page editor, and he meant well, and he said to me, Janet, when I see you, I don't see color. I said, well, then you don't see me. That's like saying, Janet, when I see you, I don't see a woman. That's like saying, Janet, and by the time I left the editorial board, so I didn't have an ulcer, but I did have irritable bowel. I was being treated for irritable bowel syndrome, which I have not had since, by the way. It's important to talk about it and to learn. And if you don't know how, that's okay. It's okay to say you don't know how. I just think it's important, though, for people from different backgrounds to have these conversations, to have authentic conversations. And I think that takes genuine interest. And I think when you have genuine interest, that reflects the interest you have in yourself and your family. What I have discovered is when I was young, I thought I was going to write the great American novel, and I was traveled far and wide looking for the great stories. And we are the stories. We're the great stories. And we want to keep an atmosphere and an environment where we can share our stories, because I think the more we share our stories, and I say this sincerely, we really are, the human family is a family. And if you start with that as a concept, communication it's not only enriching, it can enrich your life and it can inform, but it can change you. And to me, it's cliched, the only constant in life is change.